Councillor Barker got his half hour. His union delegate insisted on half an hour for lunch, so you got it. Although I have to say that Peter Paku said that the plumbers union always got an hour. So he's still complaining that he didn't get his full hour. Otherwise, we reconvene our meeting. We're short of a couple of people. Who are we short? Oh, Toru's not here. Neil. Peter Bevan. Our guest speaker, are we short him? Where's he?
No, he's here.
Oh, here he is. Anthony, welcome. So we look for, yes, Tom?
Can we invite Jenny Major to introduce
Oh, I certainly can. Should be warn me of that. I'd love Jenny. Jenny, hi. Jenny, would you please introduce our guest speaker for us?
Ka mihi kia koutou ngā mea mahonore o te RPC, or te rohe o te matawa Māori. Greetings to all of those who are representatives of the Regional Planning Committee in Hawke's Bay. Ko Jenny Major Ho, I'm a descendant of these mountains and lands and waters. It's my honour today to introduce Dr. Anthony Cole, who runs a consultancy, family whānau based, by the name of iPensiphi. Anthony has his own mihi prepared, so I'll leave his full introduction to him. How Anthony ended up being a member of the tank process is that I'm a representative for ngā kaitiaki o te awa a Ngaruroro. I have been for all but 1 year, and in a former life as a representative of Hapu Te Kauru from the headwaters of the Manawatu to the other side of the gorge. Those of us involved with the Manawatu Leaders Forum got to know about ecological economics. Drum roll, the rest is history. We now have a Prime Minister very keen to implement wellbeing indices, and it's a great time for Anthony to enter this space here in Hawke's Bay. Kia ora.
Thank you, Jenny, and big welcome to you, Anthony.
Tēnā koutou katoa e kore au e nāro he kākano e ruia mai Rangiatia. E te whanau o Rangirawa ko Papatunu ku tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. E te kākano o Rangiatia, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Nā mihi e nā iwi o nā hau e whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Nā mihi kia koe toro, te rangatira o te whanau mana whenua, tēnā koe. Nā mihi kia koutou, nā mana whakahaere te rōpū o te tiriti o Waitangi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Members of the public, members of the council, members of the Regional Planning Committee, Honourable Chair, thank you very much for having me here today. Nā mihi kia koutou. Tēnei te kaupapa, te toi ohanga o te whanau o Rangirawa ko Papatunu ku. Kia hui mai tātou katoa I runga e te whanaungatanga. Kia noho tai tātou, kia whakawhiti whakaro kōrero tai tātou katoa. Ko tōku pepeha, ko tainui te waka, ko tararua te maunga, ko otaki te awa, ko Ngāti Kora ki te hapu, ko Ngāti Raukawa ki te tonga te iwi, ko Anthony tōku ingoa. Anō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. So kia ora tātou whānau. My name is Anthony Cole. My presentation today is titled Te Toi Ohanga, Economic Theory and Accounting Methods to Support the Goal of Māori Cultural Survival. Just a little bit of background first of all. So I'm what you might call a kaupapa Māori transdisciplinary researcher, been involved, engaged by Hawke's Bay Regional Council, as Jenny said, to assist with the creation of a social and cultural impact assessment for the tank project. My research focuses in the area of Māori cultural wellbeing and survival, and I think one of the resounding lessons for me over the last 10 years is that the goal of Māori cultural survival is today not yet a given. For that reason, I've prepared a series of presentations that I roll out and give in different contexts. What I'm going to give you today is one of them. the aim of these presentations is they're really communication aids to help try and create awareness in this space and to begin dialogue around possible solutions that will help to move us towards this goal of multicultural survival long term. I hope you'll find this presentation helpful today. I think it will be very relevant, potentially to the work of the Regional Planning Committee. Just a roadmap in terms of where we're going today with this presentation. As I mentioned, focus on accounting method and economic theory that supports the long-term goal of multicultural well-being and survival, which is inextricably linked today to the participation of Māori communities partly in New Zealand's mixed market economy and their efforts towards reinstating the multicultural economy. Now, for a long time, when you get down here into the accounting space, financial accounting has been the backbone and mainstay of business activities and of economic performance. However, there are very well documented now limitations of financial accounting, which has led internationally to the development of genuine progress indicator accounting frameworks. And I think my own research interest and passion in this area kind of got a little bit of a bump a few weeks ago when our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, appeared on television announcing to the nation the intention of the Labour Party to begin moving New Zealand across toward a national accounting framework that will embrace a genuine progress indicator type framework of some kind, so that New Zealand would hopefully be the first country to assess bids for budget spending against new measures that determined not just how our spending will impact on GDP, but also on natural, social, human, and possibly cultural capital too. And I've put the cultural capital there in red just to make an important point, and it is that the Labour government at the moment sees and is beginning to acknowledge publicly the importance of cultural well-being. Now, unfortunately, the current genuine progress indicator body of theory and method has a limitation. It does not do a really good job of accounting for cultural well-being and survival outcomes. For that reason, we've been working to get funding from central government, which we've now secured to set up a research program in Te Arawa, in which we're working, and hopefully by the end of this year we'll have arrived at the creation of New Zealand's very first distinctive multicultural genuine progress indicator accounting system, which we hope will support a distinctive approach to multicultural accounting, which will in turn support the reinstatement of the multicultural economy long term. Now, for those of you that are kind of interested in accounting work, this zone over here is the domain of financial accounting, this zone over here is the domain of non-financial accounting, and then kind of in the middle here we've got this zone of mixed units accounting, which involves both financial and non-financial types of measurement. Now, this slide gives us a kind of an overview, a thematic overview now of the presentation and where we're going. What I want to do first of all is just develop a little bit more the thinking around the genuine progress indicator, and then use that as a basis for exploring more fully what happened to the multicultural economy, and last of all look at some of the limitations of financial accounting practice and the emergence of a new multicultural approach to accounting. So first of all, what is a GPI? Just hands up around the room, how many of you have actually heard of a genuine progress indicator? Okay, a couple of you. Okay, very good. So we're all familiar, I think, with gross domestic product, which is the measure of performance that is used in an economy to indicate the performance of the economy. Now, GDP as an accounting entity or indicator counts all economic transactions, and that means that natural disasters, disease, unemployment, ecological species extinction, vehicle accidents, crime, family breakdowns and suicide, gambling, drug and alcohol addiction, illness, pollution, water scarcity, overharvesting, greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation are all good for GDP. Now, when we shift over to a genuine progress indicator accounting approach, we really then have to take on board a quite substantial shift in our thinking. Now, the old GDP thinking was based on a question. That question was basically at a business level or at an economic level, how fast and how big can we grow GDP? When we shift into the GPI space, it's not that growth is irrelevant, but it's not also the most important question. The most important question then becomes, what is the best way to grow? Or is there a way or a method of growing in which we manage to avoid unwanted ecological, social, financial and cultural effects? Now, what does genuine progress actually look like if you were kind of depict it visually on a graph? Probably something like this. So on this axis here I've got per capita GDP and GPI, time on the bottom axis, and you'll notice that the GPI and GDP graphs merge together into one. So that economic growth, in other words contributions to GDP, is good for the environment. It's good for social well-being, it supports multicultural survival, it's good for financial well-being as well. Unfortunately, this is more the reality. Now this is a graph per capita of GDP, GPI for the United States of America from the years 1950 out until 2002. Now, America doesn't have a national accounting system based on the Genuine Progress Indicator. This graph was produced by a group of academics, probably up here in 2002, who used data retrospectively to actually generate this GPI index. However, there's some important lessons, I think, and characteristics that we can pull out of this graph. First of all, and hopefully this is clear, this is the economic growth component of this graph. Secondly, the area underneath that top graph there, of all this pale blue area, represents the cost of economic growth. And you can decompose that into ecological, social, financial, and including cultural costs as well. Which means that the dark blue area on the bottom represents genuine progress. In other words, in our GPI accounting system, we start with GDP, then we make a whole series of adjustments that remove the costs that are generated socially, ecologically, and culturally. That's what we're working on in order to arrive at a GPI on the bottom. Now, another interesting attribute of this graph, or characteristic of it, is that from the 1970s onwards, you'll notice that while there's very, very good, strong growth in the US economy in terms of GDP per capita, there is a flattening and downward trend in the GPI. Now, it's interesting that the key message of GPI accounting so far is that more economic growth is actually not equal to more well-being, as we have been led to believe. And this is not just the case in the United States of America. Actually, it is a consistent pattern across the Western democracies. Just put a few other GPI graphs up here for you to see. Australia, you see the same pattern. Canada, you see the same pattern. And this graph here is a composite of 17 different nations, all combined together into one GDP GPI index. So one of the, I think, key outputs of this GPI research over the last couple of decades now has been a greater understanding of the ecological cost of economic growth, the social cost of economic growth, the financial cost of economic growth, and the cultural cost of economic growth. Well, we're working on that at the moment. Now, I mentioned before that the GPI accounting system doesn't do a good job of the cultural wellbeing accounting. For that reason, I want to spend a little bit of time now developing this issue of cultural wellbeing. So why is it important that we really start to pay attention to cultural wellbeing? In the world today, there are a documented 6,900 languages globally, worldwide, which means by implication there are at least 6,900 distinctive cultural entities in the world today. Now, that's interesting, but what's more interesting is that the rate of language extinction is 1 every 3 months on average. Which means that within the next 100 years, depending on the assumptions that you use as to how we respond to this crisis of extinction, of language extinction, we currently stand to lose somewhere between 50 to 90% of the world's cultural and linguistic diversity over the next 100 years. Now, interesting question, why is this happening? For a culture to survive, there are a number of prerequisites that I've listed here. Firstly, that cultural entity must have the freedom to give expression to its language, values, behaviours, and institutions on a daily basis. Secondly, it needs to be able to adapt to change with creativity and innovation, and to respond to disturbance events in a way that reclaims, reframes, and reinstates its essential identity. Now, for our tūpuna, 1840 and onwards, colonisation was a major disturbance event that saw the rapid introduction of a new language, a new model of education, of knowledge development, including new systems of belief, and a new model of economy. Now, the decolonising pushback against these influences on Māori culture really didn't get underway until the 1970s. And I think this was promoted partly by the setting up of the Waitangi Tribunal. So that in the 1970s we began to see the revival of the Māori, efforts to revive the Māori language. The 1980s, that focus shifted then towards the importance and significance of Māori education to Māori students. In the 1990s, the publication of the book Decolonising Methodologies by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, which then I think provided a foundation for the emergence of kaupapa Māori research and the decolonising of Western science. And I put there in red ohanga. The word ohanga is the Māori translation for economy. I think the next priority in terms of decolonising pushback for Māori today is economics. And I want to develop that thought now in the rest of this presentation. But there's a key point here that emerges from a lesson, a distinctive lesson of the last couple of decades that covers this period of decolonising pushback. And it is that Māori cultural wellbeing and survival is inextricably connected to the survival and wellbeing of the Māori language, Māori approaches to education, the expression of Māori values and behaviours on a daily basis, and the survival of ohanga Māori, the Māori economy. So if the Māori economy is so important to Māori cultural survival and well-being, then what happened to the Māori economy? Now, whenever I use the term Māori economy, there's an implicit assumption amongst audiences, and it is that when I use the term Māori economy, I'm referring to the activities of Māori communities contributing towards growth in economic GDP or corporate ROI, return on investment. And this implicit assumption exists partly because there's a linguistic problem here. And the linguistic problem is that in going from the English use of the word economy to a Māori translation of that word, there is no linguistic counterpart. There's no direct linguistic translation. The word that is commonly used is ohanga, that has a slightly different meaning to the English rendering of the word economy. Ohanga, which comes from, for example, koha. In other words, the giving of a gift to support social well-being in a way that expects some long-term reciprocity. Now, I draw from this absence of a linguistic counterpart a conclusion that apparently our tupuna saw no need for this Pākehā concept that we talk about today so commonly. So is there a Māori economy? Well, the English word economy actually comes from the Latin, and the Latin itself is derived from two Greek root words, oikos meaning house and nemein meaning to manage. When you put these together you get oikonomia, or the management of the household. Now the Greeks had two words that they used to describe economics, oikonomia, the management of the household, and krematistics, which focused attention on the profit-making activities of individuals, which was viewed with some concern by the Greek philosophers of the time, Aristotle in particular, who questioned the ethical validity of this model of economic behaviour. Now, as I said before, when you shift between the Latin-English use of economy towards a Māori worldview, there is no direct translation. We use the term ohanga today. However, there is an interesting and I think quite striking similarity of meaning between these two worlds, the Greek world and the world of our tupuna, back pre-1840. Here, the Greeks talked about the presence of a household that was managed. Well, we certainly have a Māori household, the Māori whānau, and it is managed around, managed is the wrong word, it's an inappropriate word, but that household functions around the expression of a certain type of behaviour that is described by kawa, tikanga, and kaupapa. Now, just another interesting point, krematistics down here, the concept of krematistics in the Greek world finds, as far as I can see, no simple parallel within a Māori perspective of the world. Now, the last major thesis, major piece of research that was written on the Māori economy was the work of James Raymond Firth at the turn of the last century, who did his PhD thesis on the Māori economy. He was an economist anthropologist, and this thesis was later published as a book in 1929, The Primitive Economics of the New Zealand Māori, which is still available today and is a fascinating read. Now, in the preface to this book, you'll find the following statement. The life of the Māori cannot be explained on the assumption that economic interests and needs have created their social structure. Though modified by them, that structure had biological and social foundations of its own. The economic activities of the Māori were developed, in short, within a framework set by the family. So here you have, once again, now a nice reinforcement of that assumption that I drew before of the parallel between the Greek and the Māori worlds. So what is the Māori family? Next question then. How do we kind of shed a little bit of light on this? Well, here is the Māori family, the family of rangi and papa. To express this in Māori, te whānau o rangirawa ko papa tūnuku. In my mihi earlier, you'll notice that I addressed the members of this family. Here's papa tūnuku rangi nui. Here are some of the children of papa tūnuku rangi nui. This is tāne nui a rangi, the atua of the forest. This is rongo, the atua of medicinal herbs. This is tangaroa, the atua of the oceans and lakes and rivers. This is homie tiki tiki, the atua of the ferns and root vegetables. And this here is tawhiri mātia, the atua of the domain of the winds. Now you can describe this Māori family using a family tree. So for example, at the top here we've got papa tūnuku rangi nui, and then that branches down into the various children of papa tūnuku rangi nui. And bearing in mind that I've just given you a simplified version of this today, just to kind of get the basic message across, as you move from one hapu to another and one iwi to another around the country, this would take on a slightly different form. But a point I wanted to make was that when you follow the line of tāne down through here, ... eventually you come to another member of the Māori family. And that member is tangata whenua. Now tangata whenua are the teina or younger siblings of this Māori family. It's a beautiful photograph of Sir Apirana Ngata outside the Waitangi marae in 1940 at the Waitangi Day celebrations doing the haka. Beautifully illustrates tangata whenua. Now, let's follow this line of logic along. So we have the goal of Māori cultural survival that is dependent upon reinstating the Māori economy. And then when we ask the question, what is the Māori economy? What we discover was that in terms of similarity of meaning, we come here towards this entity, te whānau o rangirawa ko papa tūnuku, which is a family that is guided in its behaviour by the expression of kawa, kaupapa and tikanga. Now I draw from this the following conclusion, that there's not one model of economics in New Zealand, there are two. This one over here, the New Zealand mixed market economy. This one over here, what I refer to as ohanga Māori. That's the Māori translation of economy. This model here is based on a Pākehā worldview, this one's based on a Māori worldview. This one here preferences the use of the English language, this preferences the use of the Māori language. This one here incentivises and rewards the expression of productive and consumptive activities. This one here incentivises and rewards the expression of kawa, kaupapa and tikanga. This one here is value free, this one here is kaupapa based. This one here embraces the foundation pillars of capitalism, the need for defining clear property rights, profit making and free markets. This one here is based on the expression of whananga tanga manaki tanga kotahi tanga. This model over here supports the goal of Pākehā cultural survival really well. This model over here supports whānau Māori survival really well. This model over here tends to cause and bring about whānau Māori decline. This model over here maintains whānau Māori well-being. This model here is based on rules, laws and customs. This one here is based on kawa, kaupapa and tikanga. So we have two models in this country, and an important point I think is that they're not the same, which means that we have, I think, a very interesting challenge associated with achieving the goal of Māori cultural survival, and it is a challenge of coexistence. Now if you go back to the ohanga of our tūpuna, the economy of our tūpuna, they used this institution to live on these islands for somewhere between 800 to 1,000 years in a way that maintained their own well-being and the well-being of the natural world. Te whānau o rangirawa ko papa tūnuku. By contrast, the introduction of capitalism and the market economy within approximately 170 years has driven hapu and the natural world into decline, and in some cases to the point of extinction. Now you can see this visually. What I've done here for the mana whenua was created some map layers of the tank catchments. So you have here the Ahuriri catchment, the Karamu, the Ngararoro and the Tutaikuri, and down here below each of these map layers I've put a percentage figure that indicates the extent of coverage of indigenous forest pre-1840 in this case. And that was what was left in 2012. And we can do the same for the wetlands that once covered this landscape, or these catchments. Here are the original percentage covers. and this is what's now left. You see the same trend in my own whenua rohi, the Manawatu and the Horowhenua. So this is a map layer of the Horowhenua coastline here. Here's Kapiti Island on the bottom. Up here into the Manawatu, this is Kimbolton up here and across to the Manawatu Gorge and then along the Tararua ridgeline here. All those different colours in that map represent the pre-1840 extent and cover of Ngāhere Urutapu, or indigenous forest. On this map layer here, I then put over top of that the former extent of lowland coastal wetlands. And that's what's left today. All that yellow that you see in that image there is pastoral farming. When we did the analysis, the mathematical analysis on this, the figure we came up to with of that once expanse of coastal wetlands, there now remains 0.03%. It's not even significant statistically. You can also depict these changes empirically. So I did this exercise back 2005, 2006 and onwards as part of a forced-funded research program at that time. This graph for the Manawatu and Horowhenua between 1840 and 2009 shows you the growth of the settler population within these regions. The introduction and expansion of pastoral farming, and I think we can refer to this part of the graph as the economic or the growth of the settler economy as it was introduced at that time. However, at the same time, this is the collapse of the local Māori population. This is the decline of the Ngāhere Urutapu, or indigenous forests. This is the decline of kukuwai, or wetlands. This is the decline in indigenous grasslands, and collectively, then this is the decline of ohanga Māori, the Māori economy. Now, when I'm talking about the loss of wetlands and grasslands and forests and river and that impact that had on local rivers and wetlands, I'm not talking about those from a kind of ecological perspective where we treat those as just entities. From a Māori cultural perspective, this is decline in the well-being of the Māori family, Te Whānau Rangirawa ko Papatūnuku, which has been pushed for most of our regions around this country to the brink of extinction. Now you'll notice also that between this graph here and this graph here that I showed you earlier, the relationship between the GDP and GPI, there is a striking similarity. So back to the question, what happened to the Māori economy? It was obscured and lost in English translation, first of all. Secondly, it was ignored in academic scholarship in our state education curriculum. Its decline in extent and well-being went unnoticed and unchecked. And this well-being survival blind spot is partly a consequence of our over-dependence on financial accounting. And I want to develop that thought a little bit in the latter part of the presentation. Legislation in this country failed to protect and to provide adequate protection for the Māori economy, for the Māori whānau. The Resource Management Act is an example that I thought would be relevant today. The Resource Management Act does not provide adequate, explicit legal protection for the goal of whānau Māori cultural survival. And in an absence of that legal protection, you've seen the result. Secondly, the Resource Management Act preferences the use of English scientific language to a point that has obscured the Māori cultural meanings of ohanga and kaitiakitanga. Obscured them by a Western scientific perspective on these things. Lastly, in terms of a treaty partnership, this whānau Māori decline and near extinction outcome is really difficult to reconcile with Articles 2 and 3 of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. As I mentioned before, there is an urgent priority now in terms of decolonisation to push back on the market economic model to create a space for reinstating the Māori economy. Now, if as Indigenous communities worldwide we fail to achieve this goal, the prospect is this: over the next 100 years, we currently stand to lose somewhere between 50 to 90% of the world's linguistic and cultural diversity. Okay, so far we've looked at the Māori cultural wellbeing and survival in terms of participation in the market economy, the decline of the Māori cultural economy. I spent a little bit of time elucidating the genuine progress indicator accounting approach as an improvement on financial accounting for the market economy. And what I've also suggested is that an absence of appropriate accounting and theory and method over here created a blind spot that meant that decline in the Māori cultural economy has gone unnoticed and unchecked. In theory, we can fix that problem. So in the last part of this presentation, what I want to do now is first of all focus on the financial, the limitations of financial accounting, and then lastly explore what an emerging model of Māori accounting might actually look like that could remedy these accounting limitations in a way that adequately supports the reinstating of the Māori cultural economy. So first of all, limitations of financial accounting practice. Now, financial accounting measures business and economic performance based on an efficiency goal orientation that aims to do two things. Firstly, to maximise monetary profits and to minimise monetary costs. And this accounting method can be applied at business, regional and national scales. And an important point of distinction I want to make first of all in commenting on financial accounting is that it's not wrong. However, it is an incomplete solution to the problem of Māori cultural wellbeing and survival. And that is because it has fundamental measurement problems, chief of which is that most of what is important to Māori communities cannot easily be measured in a financial unit of account. Now, for example, if you take the expression of these kaupapa and the role of these tupuna here, or atua, in terms of maintaining and looking after the well-being of whānau Māori, the Māori family, you push well beyond the limits of market and non-market valuation. Secondly, there's a domain problem. Now, financial accounting primarily focuses on production and consumption activities and the exchange of goods and services in a marketplace, which is okay as far as it goes, but what it does not pay attention to is the use of non-renewable energy and the over-harvesting of natural resources on the input side of the economy, and pollution and ecosystem decline and energy emissions on the output side of the economy. Now, why is that important? It's important because this is the domain of Papatūānuku, Ranginui and Atua Māori, which means that they are effectively not a part of our current system of accounting. This is the blind spot that I was talking about before. And there's a further measurement problem that goes like this. In political, planning, policy making, financial and economic decision making, that which is not measured effectively has an influence value of 0. In other words, if it's not measured, it cannot be an evidential part of decision making. Lastly, in financial accounting, there is a goal orientation problem. Now, economic efficiency is not the only goal that is important to Māori communities, and this has some interesting implications for financial accounting. Now, in this table that I'm about to unfold for you, there's an important relationship, and the relationship goes as follows, that accounting goals are dependent upon the use of certain accounting methods and indicators. So we've got the accounting goals at this end, and the accounting methods and indicators right at the other end there. Let's start and work our way through this one goal at a time. Firstly, the efficiency goal. Now that requires the expression of individual preferences, which involves a low level of discussion, a very low level of innovation, because the individual knows what they want. This is the principle of consumer sovereignty. You can measure what a consumer wants or value it based on willingness to pay methodology and capture that using financial accounting method and indicators like GDP and ROI. That's pretty basic and straightforward. In other words, this accounting method supports this goal. But when you move to the goal of social fairness, you've got a different problem. Now, if you ask an individual to vote in terms of social fairness outcomes, what they'll tend to do is vote in favour of a way that maximises the greatest utility to themselves. So what you need to do is to get communities together to enter into a very high level of discussion about what social fairness actually is. And that requires a medium to high level of innovation, methods like futures dialoguing, and the use of accounting and non-financial accounting tools, which can be captured best using a GPI indicator framework. The goal of ecological sustainability. Here it's not the individual or the community that needs to sit at the decision table, it's ecosystems. So we need a voice that represents ecosystems at the table. This requires a medium level of discussion, a high level of innovation, because it requires for our science today complex models to understand the well-being needs of ecosystems. And we can capture that best using non-financial accounting method and the use of genuine progress indicators. Now, the goal that's probably of most importance to Māori communities is the goal of cultural survival. Here, you need whānau Māori, the Māori family, to sit at the discussion table to represent their views, which will involve a high level of discussion, a high level of innovation that facilitates that dialogue, and methods like the measurement of kawa, kaupapa and tikanga that can best be captured using non-financial accounting approaches and, once again, genuine progress indicators. Now here's the problem. These accounting methods and indicator sets that support this broader goal set that is of importance to Māori culture are missing at the moment. So, last of all, let's take a look now at an emerging Māori cultural model of accounting. And this, we start with the question, so what would a Māori approach to accounting actually looks like that adequately measures the well-being and survival of whānau Māori, te whānau o rangi rawa ko papa tūnuku. Now, I've been working since, I think, 2005, 2006 on a model of this kind, which I call Tātari tau utu utu. Tātari, to explore or analyse tau utu utu, points to the existence of cycles of reciprocity. And here's the basic conceptual model of how this approach to accounting actually works. So in every action that we account for in this model of accounting, there needs to be a counterpart in this reciprocal cycle. So for example, if papa tūnuku, rangi nui and atua Māori give expression to generosity towards rōpū tikanga Māori, Māori businesses, Māori communities, Māori entities, then that expression of generosity needs to be reciprocated up here in an appropriate way. So the accounting system has to measure and take account of both of these two transactions to ensure the integrity of those reciprocity cycles is maintained long term. Now, in the market economic model, that's what's happened to these reciprocity cycles. What should have been a reciprocal relationship that was defined by kaitiakitanga has actually been turned into an extractive relationship. In other words, one half side of this accounting framework has been removed. Secondly, the accounting goals of tātari tau utu utu. Now, profit maximisation and cost minimisation are not irrelevant to Māori communities. That's an important point. But the main goal of this accounting approach is the survival and well-being of whānau Māori. And this includes social and ecological well-being dimensions. When it comes to accounting method, there's a whole range of characteristics. This is an approach to accounting in which we need to account for reciprocal behaviour. That measures annual progress towards all goals of importance to Māori communities. It is value-based rather than value-free. It produces plans and policies that incentivise Māori behaviour. It avoids trade-offs as a consequence of economic growth and profit-making activities. It's based on a mixed unit of accounting, i.e. both financial and non-financial, and it is conducted by Māori communities. It's reclaimed from the knowing of our tupuna and has been reframed. We're attempting to reframe it in a modern-day context. Last couple of slides. So what I've been talking to you today in terms of an RMA planning and policy perspective, I think really sits over here. In other words, this is the past. This is how we've been doing things in the past. The RMA acknowledges the importance of Māori cultural well-being, but stops short of Māori cultural survival. And that has then flowed into policy and plan making that has been principally underpinned by financial accounting rationale and cost-benefit analysis. What I've been talking to you today is the future, and I think the future looks something like this. And will include, I think, some urgent priorities, the first of which is the goal of Māori cultural survival, the reinstatement of the Māori economy, and efforts to try and understand how the existing market economy can coexist with the Māori cultural economy, and the expansion and adoption of these new accounting practices, methods and theory. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Anthony. That was quite amazing. Okay, questions for a start. Do we have any? Paul.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cole. Wow, it's that's food for thought, and I'm really pleased that we've recorded that so I can go back and watch it again. You talked a lot about it's obviously very focused on the Māori economy. Would the same sort of principles apply when you're considering like ecological factors? Because it was one of the tables you put up there is that someone needs to speak for ecological and biological issues when we're doing planning and such.
Yeah, correct.
Is the same sort of approach around the was it the GPI? No, the Genuine Progress Indicator. Is that transformational thinking that's required to put those issues into a planning and planning framing and a planning framework rather than yeah, it's this whole. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it is. And in, I think between 2002, 2008-9, I spent a number of years working on the development of a genuine progress indicator accounting framework for the Nelson Tasman regions of New Zealand, and also for the Motueka catchment. So that modelling framework actually exists today, and it has a quite complex ecological component to it that really gives a much greater handle on ecological well-being, and interfaces that model of ecological well-being to the market economy. So the model is based, for example, in its core upon a sectoral economic model that was based on the Nelson Economic Development Agency sectoral classification. And through each of those sectors of the economy, we trace the flow of mass and energy on the input sides of the economy and the outputs. That means all the waste discharges and greenhouse gas emissions. It has a labour market model and a demographic model that provides the driver for the demand end of the economy, as well as a full spreadsheet of genuine progress indicator accounting. So in other words, for every year we push that model out into the future, we can see exactly what the implications of decisions are at a sectoral level. Now, that's an economic model, but a point that I could have made today in this presentation if we'd developed it further is that that same model can be applied in any business activity in which we are looking at the prospect of growth. So in other words, you could take a similar model of that kind and drop it into in a corporate context where return on investment is concerned. Yeah.
Yes. So to my mind, that bringing it right back down to a simplistic view,
Yeah.
is along the lines of we just got to make sure we measure the externalities when we're making decisions.
That's a real simplistic view, but that's it. With the exception that the Genuine Progress Indicator accounting framework does a very poor job at the moment of measuring cultural wellbeing and survival, which is why, as I mentioned, I think that is a separate case, particularly in New Zealand. Yeah.
I guess one of the contributions of financial accounting was to provide a means of comparing and evaluating a whole wide range of behaviors and assign them a value of some sort that could be analyzed across all those different activities and behaviors, so there's a currency as a result.
Correct.
In all the values in the Maori economy side of the equation, what becomes the currency, so to speak, of comparing, contrasting all of those values and their relative contribution to the greater good?
There may be some light that's shed on that in time. At the moment, we use the mixed units accounting system, so there is no single unifying currency that ties the whole thing together.
So have you done any case studies where you might have taken a set of activities, measured them in the current system, measured them somehow in the new system, to illustrate the bottom line difference, if you will, of the two approaches?
So the very first case study that I did in this area, I think, which dates back now to 2006, 7, 8, 9, around that era, was such a case study. And I attempted to undertake that in a way that I could do that comparison and contrast between a local, in this case it was a tikanga Māori institution, and then comparing and contrasting that with regional economic performance and looking to see, how the two actually differed. So yes, have made attempts to actually try and do that.
Chair, can I just ask a follow-up question? You talk about a mixed unit accounting system.
Yes.
Can you enlarge upon what the units are?
Yes, so the units are appropriate to the well-being of the entity we're measuring. So for example, if it's a river, it may well be metres cubed. If it's a forest, it may be metres cubed of timber, or if it's an ecosystem, then it may well be species diversity, in other words, species per unit area. So yes, we move away from the financial constraint. The problem with the pricing system is that our current pricing system was meant to signal resource scarcity back to the market, but it fails to do that for a whole raft of reasons, but one of them is because of the problem of trying to actually place monetary values on these areas of well-being that are important to Māori communities. And our current pricing system just falls short in that area. And I know for some time the economic literature has developed the thinking that it is possible through resource economics and environmental economics, you know, the fiddling around with the pricing system, market and non-market values to actually correct this. But I have to say that while all of that research and thinking is going on, Māori cultural well-being and the well-being of other Indigenous communities around the world is still on a downward spiral.
Okay, so in our case, for Tank, for instance, which you instanced, have you created a list of health indicators for this part of the economy that we can use as some sort of a yardstick for evaluation?
So I'm in the process of dialogue with mana whenua on this at the moment, and we've developed or kind of sketched up and scoped out an initial framework for how we'll do this. And I'm hoping that over the next couple of weeks that framework will start to take some form, and it will draw on some of the theory and method that I've been talking to you about today. However, it will be an incomplete work at this stage, simply because of the limited funding that we have and the amount of time we've had to finish this part of the actual assessment. So what I've suggested to the mana whenua team that I'm working with is that we put this forward as a first step in trying to scope this out and understand it, with the thought that after the Tank process is finished, we apply for some central government funding to try and take what we've done as a kind of a desktop exercise out then to the marae, to actually sit down and dialogue with hapu, so that we can grow this from the ground up over the next 10 years. So when we come back to the next Tank exercise in 10 years' time, tangata whenua are well prepared for this.
Thanks very much. A somewhat breathtaking number of assertions in your presentation, which I'm interested in. In terms of evidence for the theories you're proposing here, is there any evidence around the Māori economy pre-European that you can validate some of the assumptions you've drawn? For example, you talked about biodiversity, when the evidence is very clear in the decline in biodiversity pre-European, the clearance of vegetation by means of fire, etc. So we had an economy, and I'm assuming from your presentation that the assumption is that it's in balance, when clearly the evidence shows it wasn't in balance. So where is your evidence for the assumptions you're making about, the Māori economy and the GPI?
Yes, that's a good question, and it's a question I'm often asked. And the answer to that question goes like this. As I think was mentioned in an earlier discussion just before lunch, there's not one way of looking at the phenomenon that you're describing pre-1840. One lens through which we can look at that is clearly the lens of Western science, and the assertions that you're putting forward have come largely from hypotheses that have been put forward by Western scientists.
Well, it's evidence based on the archaeological basis. So, I mean, we had species available and in the ecosystem in the year 1000 AD, which are not there in 1840.
Yes, what we do not have is conclusive evidence of how it was that they actually disappeared. My problem is this, that you see the arguments that are put up by Western scientists of this kind, to me, run completely contrary to what I understand of the core, if I can use the term values from a translational point of view, the core Māori values that are a part of the well-being of Māori communities. So to me, there is a terrible inconsistency there. So before I can accept the views of Western scientists, somehow I'm going to have to figure out how to reconcile that with the fact that those behaviours are inconsistent with the general tenor of Māori culture.
You've lost me entirely.
It's very, very clear.
I think I'll throw one out there. I take exception to you saying that the Western culture is value-free. So can you tell me how you've come to that assertion in your presentation?
So yes, I was not saying that Western culture was value-free. What I was referring to was the body of theory that underpins what we refer today as market economics, or the neoliberal dominant model of market economics. Now, the concept of value three emerges from a number of different parts of this theory. Firstly, our pricing system. So in other words, the pricing system in our modern market economy is not based on values, it's based on two determinants of value. And those two determinants of value are supply and demand. Now, the interesting question, of course, is what else could that pricing system be based on? It could be based on ecological well-being. It could be based on social well-being. It could be based on multicultural survival as a criteria, and it's not. And the problem is then that because of the absence of those values in our pricing system, we have a market system that incentivizes behaviours that are antagonistic with those well-being outcomes. That's the first point. The second point is that the concept of value free also is applied to the operation of the actual market itself. And the idea here is that in kind of liberal economic theory, when you go back to the very early times, the basic thinking was that the market should be left to find its own direction and its own equilibration, if you like, without government intervention. Now, as soon as you put government intervention into a market, you introduce somebody's values. So the concept of a value-free market also implies that we created a space for an economic system to develop and flourish that was free from intervention. Now, of course, around the world today, we don't have the perfect free market. What we do have is a kind of continuum of different market models with a very liberal kind of market at one end and a very kind of centrally planned, controlled market at the other. The next important point, I think, is that the basic idea of economic theory was that if the economic system itself was value-free, then it would create the possibility for the individual customer, under the principle of consumer sovereignty, to express their values in whatever way they want to. Now, that's fine because in a way that respects individual human rights. The problem is customers today express their values in ways that diminish ecological well-being, that diminish social well-being, and diminish the opportunity of cultural survival for Indigenous cultures. So these are, I think, well-established concepts in economic theory, and you know, I don't honestly see a simple way out of that.
You clearly would applaud the government's move to move in the direction of the GPI. And regional councils are not noted for being cutting-edge innovators, fast adopters, early adopters of anything, let alone something like this. So from our standpoint as principally, let's say, an environmentally oriented agency, simply the recognition and valuing of ecological services and ecological costs to our activities would be a very significant step forward, would it not?
It certainly would.
And in doing that, that would also advance, that's a big chunk of what you're headed toward with specific reference to Maori economy. Is it 60% of it? I mean, it doesn't include health, for example. I mean, other things, but.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's a challenge that we now need to face. And we need to face it because if we don't, Māori cultural survival is at risk. And that's why I spent so much time labouring that point in the presentation. For a long time, we've found it convenient to walk away from these issues and to allow them to continue. I think we've got to a point now where we can't do that any longer. We have to face these things.
Sorry, just to follow up from what Tom was saying there. So is it the Section 32 analysis? Is that where this sort of thing would come into it in terms of what we're doing here? Is how we look at that particular issue. So a question for either Tom or James: would something like this fit into a Section 32 analysis, or are we restricted by the wording of the Act itself, the RMA itself, as to what we can do when we're considering that?
Section 32 is fairly open-ended and empowering, so it's got some basic requirements, but what constitutes the costs, the benefits, the impacts on society is really over to us to determine. And there are certainly elements here that I think can be brought in. The key challenge for all of this is measurability and the resources it takes to undertake that level of measurement and to do it in a way that's comparable, consistent over time, those sorts of things. So we use MCI, as you well know, as a measure of ecological health, which is, like Dr. Cole suggested, it's a measure of biological diversity over a set area, spatial measure, and that is a fairly good proxy within aquatic water bodies of a sense of good ecological function, which has 20 plus different drivers at any one time. So it's quite a good holistic measure, and probably quite a good proxy for measuring the sort of well-being in an environmental sense that I would have thought would be consistent with what tangata whenua are looking for. But there might be other mātauranga measures which are as effective or not, and I guess we'll see some of that come through from the proposal from mana whenua.
Thanks for that. It's certainly something I'd like to see us further explore at some stage, have that discussion, because I find it fascinating, and I think it's be well worthwhile.
The most immediate place that hits the road for us is compliance costs. We are constantly presented with compliance costs as a cost, with no offsetting benefit. And more progressive people, including more progressive farmers and growers, appreciate that there is two sides to the currency there. Our contribution to the exercise might be in a Section 32 analysis or whatever, to make some greater effort to estimate what the benefits are, the economic benefits of compliance. And it's not simply a cost on the ledger sheet. It delivers benefits at the end of the day, which can be costed out. This council did some work somewhere along the line with respect to the erosion and everything, at the big rain event a few years back, that put did an economic analysis of what the consequences were of losing all that soil and so on and so forth. So it does seem like we're not too far away, in at least that realm, from beginning to kind of recalibrate the equation somehow.
So look, on the weekend I received initial start of a proposal to the Provincial Growth Fund on behalf of the Regional Council to fulfil the action we have under the Matariki Regional Economic Development Strategy, which is to undertake a natural capital stocktake of the region, which would measure the stocks and flows of ecosystem services and the benefits they deliver to both the environment and society. So that's been on our to-do list for about 2 years now. And we've never had funding for it, so we're putting forward a proposal to the Provincial Growth Fund, which would help underpin our understanding of the natural resource endowment of the region, what it's delivering today, what it could deliver in the future, and what's at risk in terms of the loss of natural capital, etc. So these are all, well-established methodologies, and there's plenty of people around that we can commission to do this stuff. And again, it just comes back to priorities when we're trying to do some more basic stuff like just set limits on water bodies and try and hold consent holders to those limits. So we'll be bringing forward to you a proposal around that in due course.
I mean, when you think of your presentation that you made in terms of long-term plan forums, and you put your slide up there about soil loss, and everybody is wowed by the tonnage, the volume of it, but we never actually put a dollar sign on what's the economic loss implied with all of that loss. So we then say we're going to spend $100 million, let's say, on afforestation of hillsides, which again strikes everybody as a huge cost, without quantifying, well, what is the capture we're making there economically by protecting the soil that we do have. So does $100 million of afforestation create $300 million of value on the ground? That sort of
So
thing.
look, this goes to the conversation Neil and I were having at lunch, and really the point he was raising earlier on around the lack of measurement of the the effectiveness of our interventions and the value that they deliver or don't deliver. And we were discussing the ultimate progression of our state of environment monitoring at the moment, which is very biophysical, very much standalone. We spend many millions of dollars annually on doing that as an organisation, and we pump out reports. You see all those, but what we don't then do is make all the connections into social, economic well-being, and then how our interventions are having an impact on all of that. So that's an area for further work. It is where Angel's fair to tread a little bit in terms of resource implication, but ultimately I think as we start to ask the community to pay more for both their rates and directly for our services, and we spend more, we've got a duty on this organisation to also co-invest alongside that in better understanding the value and efficacy of what we're doing.
I feel this is actually heading to, this thing is a very, if you look at it, a very deep philosophical discussion rather than one on simple two-ledger accounting. It's all been cast as accountancy. Well, it's not about accountancy at all, in my view. I want to start from a different point. Is I went to a place in Western Africa one time and saw the remains of a house of a guy who had become very wealthy, and he traded gold. And he went down the coast to trade with the people down there gold for salt. And for equal measures of salt, he got equal measures of gold. Now, according to some analysis, that would be a valueless transaction, which is supply and demand. But I'd say there's enormous values in that. Now, the fact is that there's no numbers attached to it. It doesn't mean to say there's not a trade. And the other point that's important here is that people have traded all the time, whether it be within individuals, within whānau, within groups, we've all been traders, we've all traded. And we've all had these things which we've traded backwards and forwards. And you go all over the Pacific, and you'll see signs of where our Polynesians have traded enormous distances at probably, if you're working in accountancy, it was a huge cost, but they did it. So what we've got here is, I think we on occasions get overly fixated on numbers and unnecessarily. I come back to Tom's point. I don't think the fact that we have only got 4 or 5 million tonnes going out of it and we didn't put a price on it, people all said in their heads, too much. When we said 100 million, I think people equated 100 million trees directly to it. They said, this is a start. I don't think people put, the numbers on it to make it an equation. We said we have to do something here. So I think there are things that I feel too often in these transactions discussions. We look at the numbers and we get bedazzled by the numbers where we shouldn't do. And the other thing is that we as people from the dawn of time have been traders one way or the other. And it's changed and changed dramatically, and it will do so again. There's no being static here. And look at this in an interesting way. You put into the arena a proposition to look at things differently. I accept the challenge of that. But I'm not sure that we're the ones, the best recipients of it. We can't do these things on our own. There's got to be central government that's got to be key to this, but also our communities have got to be key to it. We've got to accept there are different things. Now, we might set up the trades different from what you proposed here, but I do think we all agree things need to change. We're not living in a perfect society. So if your challenge is to look at the imperfections, I accept the challenge. If you set the challenge is to do better, I accept the challenge of that too. But I'm not quite sure I accept the prescription you have of how to get there. But I do think it's worth a conversation. Certainly a serious thing about it. And I think we have to look at deeply within inside ourselves. All of us have values. And I, like Debbie, don't accept that a lot of these things that you see put as valueless, they all have values. We just don't look at them enough to get what they are. Sometimes they're so broadly accepted, we do not see the values that are in them, but they are there. And we maybe have values we don't accept, but they're still values. But we just have to have a better conversation, because you point to decline, let's accept it. We need to do better.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Anthony. I mean, you can see with this group that if you get them going, they will seriously get them going in some sort of esoteric direction that we'll never cope with. So certainly I'm rather challenged by some of the things you said too. I'm really interested in, you used the word disturbance rather than disruptive. And I would use the words disruptive, and all cultures and all businesses have had disruptive factors hitting them. My own culture, we used to live in the lowlands until the English come and threw us out and sent us off to Northern Ireland and destroyed our crofters and took away our language and all our wealth and everything. So I don't think all cultures have had these disruptive influences, and certainly all businesses have. So getting into the economics, I think there's a general acceptance internationally that this market-driven economy, and nobody knows more about this than me, and Councillor Barker will be silent on that matter, because I was a strong advocate and actually had lunch with Mr. Friedman once, and the other chap that was there paid, but it's not just over the last 100 years. This has happened over the thousands of years, as Rick pointed out. And I have the privilege of going to China a lot, and just to see the disruptive influences on their indigenous populations, and as the Han Chinese moved throughout China, just like the Anglo-Saxons moved throughout what we know as the Western world now. So we've all, over the thousands of years, we've had these disruptive influences, and we have created a market economy that has not been responsible for its outside influences, such as its influences on the environment. But I think that's changing, and if I had a question to you, but it's not a question, so it's rhetorical, because I have some faith in what's happening with young people at the moment, especially in Europe, and to a limited extent here, that are actually making their purchases based around these things. Especially in Germany, as sort of leads our world at the moment, and I have a bit of association there as well, where they will not buy stuff that has a poor regard for the economy, and their corporations who work internationally have to report back to the German government on what they're doing for those economies. So I just have some faith that the world's moving in a different direction. Sometimes we've got to push and shove some of our own people because they're not going to move as quickly as they need to move, and I think you're dead right. Tana Te Whenua and the cultures that are based around that are at a tipping point, and we might just have enough time just to save it and save the language and save the culture, and there's a lot of work going in that direction, and I really strongly support that, because it's such, if you talk internationally, there's actually so few Māoris in the world, really, 700,000 perhaps. And you look at the indigenous groups in China, and there's millions there. So this is certainly a culture and a people well worth saving, and it's got to be a treasure for our society. How we move that into economy, I'm not sure. I'm not sure way Ngāi Tahu would look at this. They have ruthlessly improved their balance sheet in a Western style, and so have Tainui. Ruthlessly and effectively, and now they're giving it back, of course, but their balance sheets reflect their ability to do that. So it's very complex, and I think that's what you've done, and I've raved on now as bad as Rick. But there's a huge discussion and a huge thought process which we're all having here, and you've inspired us just a little bit more. So thank you. And Toro, you're going to thank our guest.
I do want to actually talk about some of the comments that have been made here. Now, Rex, is not about the quantity of Māori, it's about the quality of Māori.
Just saying this, bugger all of you.
And there is ample evidence, to show that, yes, there's been degradation. Ample evidence. And even in my lifetime, my father used to have this a little boat. We'd get out there, put a drag net out, and we'd pull in enough fish to feed about 7 families. Those are the measurements that I look at. And it's good that today we've had a good discussion about measurements, because really that's what it comes down to. How do you measure what you are doing is going to make a difference? And are you going to get the result that you actually want? So for us as Māori, you know, this place here was just full of eels, and now, you know, and they're hard to kill, but you know, they're hard to find now. Our people are getting sick from not just gathering kaimora, they're getting sick from drinking the water that we're meant to be good stewards of. So there are a lot of things that we need to do to examine what our economic system is. In terms of observations of the past, I mean, a lot of the scholars who came on boats, like with Captain Cook and all that, they wrote a lot of stuff down, the observations. And they said that Māori people were probably the most healthy specimens that they'd seen, you know, in terms of their teeth, everything, in terms of their well-being, their physique. So health-wise, yeah, we were in a bad state, you know. Yeah, so we all know the obvious, you know. I've said at this table before, you know, you don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. We don't need scientists to tell us about very basic things. We all know what we need to do to make the change and the difference. You don't need anyone else to tell you. Just, yeah, anyway. Kia ora tātou. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. Thanks for integrating. I think that's really great. Thanks, mate. Okay, team. After that, we are moving to item 12.
Well, do you want to move the report, Mr. Chair?
Oh, no, we will. Yeah, I do. Thank you. You're a mover?
Yes, I moved.
And we have a seconder? Debbie seconder? You want to speak?
Just very briefly, because just to follow on, you've given me the lead on this, Mr. Chair. I just want to say this, Mr. Chair, that in my view of the Māori world and the Māori economics is that things are looking up. I've got, in my lifetime, I've seen very significant renaissance of Māori. I can imagine in 50 years' time Māori will be the dominant players throughout the economy. There's plenty of evidence to support that. And I sometimes get a little grumpy with the shroud waving around the status of Māori at present times. For example, the health statistics overall show significant increases in health, overall population increases. So I'm not pessimistic about Māori future. In fact, I think it is the future. And I go back to the assumptions, and we heard plenty of those made today around the Māori economy in 1840. Well, a thriving economy actually, and some strong economists amongst them. They made it a very strong economic decision to enable the Western world to come their way for economic reasons in many respects. So I reject some of these arguments about some sort of naive positioning of pre-European. I think it was a very strong, vigorous community and remains so today. It went through a bit of a dip during the early parts of the last century, but I think I see it on the way up. And I'd hate to see us adopt somewhat of an evidence-free model to direct and to pursue for this council going forward. We do need, as the Deputy Chair today has said, we need evidence, we need information, we need a measure, and I've seen nothing today that tells me that we've settled on measures that really will make a difference.
I'm completely lost because I was moving report number 12. I thought you'd moved on to that. That was what I was seconding. Yes.
Are you prepared? To second?
No, I thought you said the agenda item number 12.
We're just.
Just ngā mihi kōrua. It was quite interesting, all the views. I mean, I saw something just totally different. I thought, well, was supporting all the kōrero that I had. And I do think that we're going in a positive way, Neil, but we still, in my family, only have one person that's got to 70. The average age in my family is 55, and I'm a bit concerned because I'm on the mark. They weren't takers of drugs or smoking, actually. So so it's very real that the impacts and influences over the last 175 years have not quite hit the mark. And that is a driver behind my kōrero of, I saw a clear picture of people seeing something, as Rick said, and someone was at the front of the mountain and someone was behind the mountain. And it gives them, to me, an indication of perhaps some of the discussions that we need to journey going forward to get some middle ground, because I was quite opposite to some of the views expended, and that's fine. I just think we need an opportunity going forward to get some middle ground. And measurements, I'm absolutely for measurements and a clear process before we even start the journey. That's a clear process. So, kia ora. I look forward to the rest of the week.
Are there any other speakers? All those in favour of accepting that report?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, now we'll move to item 12. Statutory update. Oh, Debbie was going to move that straight up. Now, Debbie, we're on item 12, mate. Do you want to... Are there any questions on item 12? You'll second it. Oh, just wait. Okay, look.
So we've gone from 10
Are there
to
any
12.
questions on the statutory report? Let's just, otherwise we have a mover, and Janella's going to second it. All those in favour? Unless you want to speak, Debbie? There's someone's... No one. Okay. We've moved it. We're off. Okay, minor items on the agenda. LTP supplement.
Yes. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is just for noting and putting on the table to be included at a later date. It is, trying to find my notes now, LTP recommendations from the tangata whenua, thank you, around identifying good opportunities to build capacity and capability as identified by the joint submission put into the LTP.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oil and gas, Tom?
Yeah, I put this on before I was aware of what Gavin had to say. So I would just, what I was going to ask was for a report on, at our next committee meeting, as to whether we should be proceeding with the oil and gas plan change, given the extremely remote likelihood of oil and gas development in the future, and the possibility that we could deploy those resources to something more useful.
Thank you, Tom. Genetics?
Thank you, Chair. When we considered a genetically modified organisms plan change some time back, there were 3 different cases before the courts that had to be finalised. One before Northland, one before the Hastings District Council, and the other one before the Auckland Council. And just to let people know that the Northland Regional Council one has been finalised. Was really interesting finding in terms of Federated Farmers got a bit of a smack on the hands. And just to let people know that we're 1 down, got 2 more to go.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, I've got one, Matariki Reds. You all know that we have regional economic development. I have been concerned for some time that we do not have a good governance overview on that, and we have now established one with the regional mayors, including myself, 5 treaty claimant groups, the iwi, Business Hawke's Bay, and the DHB. So that will be the group, the governance group. They will all be chairs that will take our region strategically forward in terms of economic development. our meeting. Thank you very much for attending. Yes, Karanga, will you close our meeting, please?
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui kia tātou, karakia whakamutunga, matua tamo wera tapu ane poro, whakapainga e nea haere o tātou e hui mai, o mai te piki ora me mawhatanga mga anu tautoko, ai ni aka nei ai.